Okay, so I'm going to remind the people online to please mute your speakers so that we don't hear the feedback coming through on our end. If you wouldn't mind muting, those of you that are online, thank you. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the very first seminar series for the Women's Health Cluster. I'm going to give a very different talk than I normally give, so this is not, there will be some science in it, but it's not my science. My science talk will be October 16th, so I welcome you to that one. This is going to be more of a rant, so I apologize ahead of time, and I'll try to describe my rant and subdue my rage as much as possible as I go along. First, before I really start, I want to give it a land acknowledgement that we are on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people, and for that, I sincerely thank them. This series is meant to showcase a multidisciplinary perspective on a range of women's health topics. So while I'm representing the very first one on women's health, I want to make it very clear that we will have many different perspectives. And I'm from the biological side, but we'll have many on the social side and economic side and global health side as we go along. And trainees, it doesn't have to be just for trainees. If there's members of the public here that also want a certificate of completion, you're more than welcome to get one. So there's a process involved if that's if you want. And we haven't made up the certificate yet, but it'll be shiny and nice. So just to give you an idea of the broad topics that we have and speakers that we have, this is a list, and it's on our website, and we're happy to, we have a news letter we can send out to you as well with all of the topics. And we're very full. We're going to change a couple of these dates because we're trying to have them every other week from January to April, and we're already booking into next September. So I think it's fabulous, but you can likely see here that we have speakers from English, speakers from economics, so that multidisciplinarity should really shine through. The other bit is that I'll be talking about women's health, but everything I say will be very general for women. If it's for visible minorities and gender diverse peoples, it's going to be many-fold worse. So our knowledge for women is quite limited. Our knowledge for gender diverse individuals is even worse. And we will have some speakers on those specific topics, and that will be part of our cluster. And I look forward to hearing from them. So why women's health? So there are many reasons for women's health. That's why we need this multidisciplinary cluster. And I'm trying to convey to you why I think it's a really important topic to spotlight. On October 10th, actually, the BC Women's Foundation will be releasing a report of which I did, some of us in this room did some work for. And they'll be giving, I've seen their short video that they have, and it's really informative and wonderful. So I urge you to pay attention to the news releases that come out of that. Clearly, women share a greater burden of disease. They also make less than men do. I think it's about 83 cents to the dollar that women make in Canada. And that actually has some implications for women's health, and Marina Adshade will be talking about that, I think, in January. I think it's our first talk in January. There have been a number of popular books that have been written lately, all this year, I think, that have come out based on the consequences of women's exclusion, either from clinical trials or just data in general. So Doing Harm, Estrogen Matters, about hormone replacement. But also Invisible Women. I don't have that book. I ordered it. It's on back order now, even in Amazon. But it's about exposing data bias in a world designed for men. And really, one of my first interactions with this is, you know, the automatic doors that open, right? And I always used to think it was a metaphor for my life because those automatic doors never open for me. And I thought, am I invisible? What's going on? Why don't they open? I see some other people shaking their heads. But it's because they're designed for the average height of men, not the average height of women, and I'm actually a little short for a woman, so all you have to do is like wave over your head and the doors magically open for you. I am no longer invisible, so once you can hack that male bias data world, we can make it work for us, but why should we have to? It's better if we include women from the onset. Also popular literature, so if you take a look at news articles, you'll see a lot of attention starting to being paid to this issue. And it's not just our biological health, but also our barriers to access to care. And I'll talk a tiny little bit about that, but there'll be expert speakers on this later. So when women go to the doctor's office, they're not, maybe some of their symptoms are not treated as seriously as they should be, so how doctors take women's pain less seriously. And that often leads to a struggle to diagnose women. And that diagnosis can result in a misdiagnosis because of gaps in knowledge, which I'll talk a little bit about today, but also in terms of barriers to access to care. And all of that melds together to cause gaps in women's care. This paper came out, this is a news article written about the paper, but it came out earlier this year, and it looked at a variety of diseases and indicated that women are being diagnosed later. It might be sometimes because the disease is manifesting a little later. I'll tell you an example of that. But it's also because of this misdiagnosis and not treating the symptoms as seriously. And on average, across a variety of diseases, it's about 2 years later than men. It was published in Nature Communications. This also is to remind me to say that symptoms are misdiagnosed or misread in emergency rooms, particularly for heart attacks and stroke for women. It is, again, much worse for visible minorities and gender diverse, and in this case for younger patients, because they're not expected to have a stroke, so why would this be presenting as a stroke? This came out yesterday, and I thought it was funny because it was on CBC website, and because last 2 nights, I don't know why, I haven't slept very well, a little anxious for this talk, and I just thought it was kind of funny because it says 30% of Canadians suffer from a sleep disorder, but less is known about women's insomnia. But that's what we need to change. Now, I need you to pay attention to this part because there is going to be a quiz. I am going to give you a definition of sex versus gender. It's the same definition that the World Health Organization uses and CHR uses. And I am really more of a sex difference researcher, so I can answer more questions on the biological and physiological characteristics that define males and females, and less about gender, which is a psychosocial construct, which is what a given society deems appropriate in terms of a role for men versus women in society. So here's my Canadian husband depicting what's appropriate for household cleaning in Canada, or at least it's a one-woman show to try and get it so that it's men that are always vacuuming. That is a joke, but obviously gender can also refer to identity and gendered institutions and gendered environments, and that all plays a role. For the people that think of the biology, I often think of gender as being an environment, like a sex by environmental interaction, and all of that's going to play a role in terms of our health. So here's your quiz. I'm not lying. There is a quiz. So are you ready for the quiz? I know some of you are very ready. Gender was determined by visually examining the gonads. True or false? False! Gender was determined by examination for the presence of testes or ovaries. True or false? False! Social and gender roles have been redefined to permit wider participation of women. Is true. What might surprise you is that all of these examples come from research articles written about fish. Yes, fish. Fish where it's kind of difficult to determine whether their society deems something appropriate for men versus women. So 99% of those articles used gender when they actually meant sex. And that is something that is going to impede progress if we don't use the correct terminology. So again, I'm going to be talking more about sex differences. And when I'm referring to sex differences, I'm referring to things like biological and physiological characteristics. And a lot of them you can see right off the bat. And probably the biggest one is body size, right? Typically, males are bigger than females. And that's seen in most of those species. But in some species, like the frog there, it's the females that are much larger than the males. So you can't say it's a universal feature. In other species, the males are considered to be more beautiful than the female of the species because they're more colorful. But in other species, the opposite might be true. So I'm a neuroscientist, so I care a lot about sex differences in the brain. And this can raise some eyebrows. But sex differences in gray matter volume, you can see there depicted in this review study. The red refers to female greater than male, the blue male greater than female. And you can see it's not like, oh, one whole hemisphere, one half of the brain shows a ginormous sex difference. It's not like that. It's pockets of different areas that show these sex differences. And people conflate sex differences with sexism. And we can't allow that to happen. I mean, obviously it's going to happen to a certain extent, but we need to use this information because there are a lot of sex differences in brain disease, prevalence of brain disease, and I'll talk about that in just a second. We need to use this knowledge so that we can understand why those sex differences might manifest in disease. And doesn't mean that we need different treatments. And hopefully I'll convince you along the way that, yes, we might need that. Here's another example of a fairly prominent sex difference, and that is connections. So females have more interhemispheric connections and males have more intrahemispheric connections. And again, that might have play a role in terms of where stroke outcomes, for example. And I can give you an example of that later if you want. The other thing that people sometimes conflate is sex differences versus sexual dimorphism. So dimorphism refers to exact opposite findings. When most of the time we see sex differences, we see something on a scale. We don't see opposing findings. Sometimes we do, but it's generally on a scale. And so this article came out a few years ago, and it made quite a splash because what they tried to show was that there's no such thing as a female brain and a male brain. And I've already sort of argued that there are sex differences. That doesn't mean you look at a brain and you can automatically tell that it doesn't come out pink and blue. Right? You can't automatically tell whether a brain comes from a female versus a male. But what you can do is it's a mosaic. And even in the title, they actually talk about how they were expecting, if it was a female brain or a male brain, that you'd see a penis in the male. They literally say these words: a penis in the male brain and a vagina in the female brain. Of course, you're not going to see that. It's not that we have completely different bodies that we can't. We have to move the same. We have the same number of arms. And we have the same number of legs. Our brains have to manifest that as well, right? So the differences are on a much more of a smaller scale. And then even within the study, they used this diagram on the right, which is 116 different brain areas where they looked at gray matter volume, just gray matter volume for this particular part. And each one of those lines is a certain individual. And the pink, it meant to detect more female-like, the male, more male-like of these different areas. And I think what you can clearly see is, yes, we're a mosaic. All of us are mosaics. Otherwise, it would be a very boring world to live in. It would be like Stepford Wives or something like that, where we all acted the same. We don't. But I think what you can clearly see is that on the female side, there's more pink, and on the male side, there's more male-like. And again, it's not something we should shy away from. Right? It's not sexism to say that there are differences in the brain. I always think it's really interesting because the common inference is this is sexist and it shows that the male brain is superior. Why doesn't this show that the female brain is superior? It's just showing there's differences. I think the female brain is superior. I'm just joking. But I always think that that's one of the interesting things is that people take it to mean that we have an inferior brain, which is far from the truth. So there have been a number of articles like the one I said. There's a book called The Gendered Brain that argues against the idea of a female brain versus a male brain. I think it's not helpful for us to try to dichotomize it that way because they're not a dichotomy. It is a mosaic, but some of these differences we need to pay attention to because it results in a manifestation that's a little different. It might result in treatments that might need to be different. We also have to watch some biases and notions, and there's a big seated bias and notion that's been out there for a long time, and that is there's no point in studying females because they have these pesky hormones and they're much more variable than males. That is absolutely not the case. They're not more variable than males. That doesn't mean that hormones aren't important. I'm a neuroendocrinologist, so of course I think hormones are important. I think they rule our world. But hormones are important. They're equally important in males as they are in females, and I'll give you some proof for that. The last little point that I want to make, this is not my research talk, as I said. I'll be doing that a month from now. But I study the hippocampus, which I think is a really amazing structure, but I'll try not to talk about it right this second. If you look at volume of that structure, studies will often find that males have a larger volume than females. But you do have to take into consideration that the head size for an average man is much larger than the head size for an average woman. And when you take that into account, that intracranial volume, the size of the brain, you actually see no evidence of no evidence for sex difference in volume. And sometimes you actually see that females can have a larger volume than males. So it's important to think of some of the kinds of correction factors that you might need for those automatic doors and thinking about structures, brain structures. The other thing that I think people don't always think about is that there are many types of sex differences. So there, and I'll talk about this in just a second, that the idea now is to integrate sex differences in everything, integrate the inclusion of both sexes in everything we do. But I think forcing everyone to become a sex difference researcher will only go so far because people don't maybe understand that it's actually a field in its own right. So I hope that the slide can illustrate this. So there's at least 4 types here. So the first one there is a qualitative difference. So I'm going to talk a little bit about sexual posture, mating posture, and I'll talk about it in rodents. So females show lordosis. I'm not going to demonstrate it, but they have an arched back. See, I'm trying to demonstrate it right now. They flick their tail away and they display their genitals for the males to mount. So males show mounting. So that's a very qualitative difference in sexual receptivity. A quantitative difference might be something like verbal articulation. You give a verbal articulation test, females are much better at that than males are. And it doesn't mean that males can't articulate. They can still talk. It's just on average, females perform a little better than males do. And so you see these overlapping bell-shaped curves. Population difference. This could be something like major depressive disorder. In major depressive disorder, females are more likely to show comorbid symptoms with anxiety. Males are not. Not as. They still show comorbid anxiety symptoms, but less likely to. And D is my favorite. That is when you don't actually see a an overt sex difference in the behavior or any kind of trait that you might be interested in, but the underlying neural mechanisms are completely different. So if you're a researcher that's just adding your token females, or a female researcher that's adding your token males, you might miss something because you're not looking deep enough to see whether the trait that you are interested in is organized the right way, or the same way, not the right way. There's no right or wrong, just in a different way. There are a number of sex differences in prevalence of disease, but also in the manifestation or even the onset of disease. So schizophrenia, for example, doesn't really show some studies show a little bit of a greater prevalence in males compared to females. But the onset of schizophrenia, age of onset, does differ. So males tend to get it a little earlier than females do, about 2 or 3 years earlier in adolescence. But then females have a secondary jump right around perimenopausal age, around 40 to 45. And that matters, right? Studying those things matter because it gives us clues about the disease, about how the disease develops, the manifestation, and that treatment of disease. It also allows us to build better models of disease. Our understanding even of human disease isn't great, and I'm going to argue that part of that is because we don't always consider sex differences in the disease. But it also allows us to build better preclinical models of the disease, both in terms of using humans or animals. If for nothing else, we should pay attention because our federal agencies are starting to pay attention and mandating that we need to include sex as a factor. And so NIH in the U.S. in 2014 mandated the inclusion of sex as a biological variable, so they call it SABV. In Canada, we have CIHR, the Canadian Institutes for Health Research, and they just started, and they've had boxes where they ask you to consider whether you're using sex or gender, but just this year they started making it a scoreable factor in terms of getting grants, and they call it sex and gender-based analysis. In the FDA, for example, the Food and Drug Administration in the U.S. in 2013, for the first time ever, said that there needed to be a different dose, not a different drug, not a different treatment, which is where I think a lot of this field needs to go, but a different dose, and it was for the sleep aid Ambien. It turns out there's much more of, because females are metabolizing it differently, much more in their system the next morning, and a dangerous amount. So far, only one drug has been mandated to have a different dose, according to the FDA. 60 Minutes did a great episode in 2014, and you can search it on YouTube, and I urge you to watch it. I think it's kind of crazy that we don't have mandated, what I just said wasn't completely true. There are some more drugs that are coming out with different doses, which I think is important because I give you as evidence A, jury, a picture of my kids and their nanny, their childhood nanny. They no longer have a nanny because they're 20 and 23. They probably need a nanny, but they no longer have a nanny. But you can see that on our pill bottles, it'll often say take one pill if you're an adult. It doesn't say take one pill if you're 180 pounds and take half a pill if you're 100 pounds. But clearly that's going to matter. Dose is going to matter. So what causes a sex difference in disease or physiology? And I borrowed this slide from Art Arnold. It can be at least two things. One is sex chromosomes, XX, XY. The other is sex hormones. But I'm mindful that that gendered part, that environmental part, also plays a role. So that for those of us that are more on the biology side, we can think of that as loosely as like a sex by environmental interaction. And there are a number of them out there. I'm hoping to get Gillian Einstein to come out and talk about it because she's been really a pioneer in talking about sex and gender interactions. So XX, XY is represented in every single cell throughout your body, not just in the gonads, everywhere. And the genomes between two men are 99.9% similar. And hopefully you can see that that 0.1% can really make a difference in terms of phenotype, right? So imagine knowing that the genome is that similar between two males, it's also that similar between two females. The genetic difference between a man and a woman is 15 times greater than the genetic difference between two men or two women. So knowing how much of an effect 0.1% can make, imagine how 15 times more can make an even bigger difference. And that's something that's really rarely considered in terms of the genetic literature. You can test in the animal world, you can test whether or not sex chromosomes make a difference. And this is a 4-core genotype model that was developed in part with Art Arnold. And basically what they did was they took one gene from the Y chromosome called the SRY, sex-determining region of the Y chromosome. They took it away so that they could have an XY mouse, if my mouse will work, XY mouse, and they took away this gene. So it's phenotypically a female. They've also taken an XX mouse and added in the SRY gene to make it a phenotypic male. So in this way, they can do the studies where they look at whether sex hormones or sex chromosomes are causing the effects that you see. So sex chromosomes, we know, cause some of these effects, but also sex hormones. Anytime you see a sex difference, that's a cue you to think that hormones are going to be involved. I forgot to say something key, because you're thinking, she's talking about women's health all of a sudden, now she's talking about sex. I forgot to tell you, it's written here, but I still forgot to tell you, that I'm going to tell you why sex is important to study, and then I'm going to tear it all down and say this is why it's important to study females. Not that it's not, we need it, so the phrase of the whole thing, and if you want to leave now, you can, integration and specialization. That's what I want you to remember, integration and specialization. Okay, sex hormones also matter. And here's another lovely picture of my children, because why not? And so I'm talking, so we're all on the same page, talking about ovarian hormones like estrogens in females and testicular hormones like androgens, like testosterone in males. Doesn't mean we don't have each other's hormones. We do, they're just at different concentrations. And these hormones work on receptors that are located pretty much throughout the body, certainly throughout the brain. There are a number of these different kinds of receptors that are located, and it gets obviously much more complicated than that. Testosterone can be converted to the most powerful of the estrogens called estradiol. It also gets converted into a very powerful androgen called dihydrotestosterone. And sex hormones themselves can affect symptomology and treatment. And I'm going to give you another example from the schizophrenia literature. This is across the menstrual cycle. So as estradiol levels decline, psychotic symptoms are on the increase. So you can imagine that if you're looking at a treatment effect, but you don't account for the menstrual cycle, you might get you might see that there's a lack of an effect when actually there could be an effect. So it's something that is important to consider. Ovarian hormone cycles, primates, menstrual cycle, and in most rodents, it's a estrous cycle, which is about 4 to 5 days. And this study came out in 2014, and it's called Female Mice Are Liberated for Inclusion of Neuroscience and Biomedical Research. So what they showed definitively, they've done this now in mice and they've done it in rats, and they've definitively showed that there's no difference in variation. So The idea that females are more variable than males just doesn't hold water. They're not. They looked at a number of different kinds of variables. What I think they kind of missed the boat on was that part that I've highlighted there. I think that's a really important message. That's the most important message. They're not different in terms of variability. So the idea that females are more variable, we shouldn't use them, is conclusively not true. But that doesn't mean that that variability isn't caused by hormones, both for males and for females. So in this particular article, they said, hey, housing really matters. So in mice, people that will know this, if you house them singly versus in a group housed, you can have much differences in variability in terms of behavior for those male mice. But also, you change testosterone levels, and we can talk about why. So of course, I always will defer to the fact that it's hormones and that hormones rule the world. It's not always the case, but certainly certainly is a big suspect for that. And here's some evidence for both rodents and humans that the ovarian hormone cycle can cause some changes. So we see it in terms of neurogenesis, we see it in activation in both humans and in rodents. Even across the menstrual cycle, you do see some gray matter volume differences, which is a bit hard to wrap your head around, but there are a number of studies now that show that, and even in terms of fractional asymmetry. Sex hormone levels differ by age and by experience, and I'm going to show you this in males because everybody knows that happens in females, but probably fewer of you know that it also happens in males. So that first graph is showing you from the age of 30 to 70, 80-ish, a precipitous decline in testosterone levels. Even with experience, parenthood, testosterone levels decline in males. So that's both AM and PM levels that you can see there. And it even exists after the child is over a year of age. So hormones are not just variable in females, they're variable in males. So again, pesky hormones, we shouldn't study females. They haven't been included in clinical trials because we're so variable. Because we have these monthly cycles. Well, males, and I know some of you know this, males have a diurnal fluctuation in hormones. Diurnal, every day. Who's more variable now, I ask you? So they have higher levels in the morning than they do in the evening, and it varies by age, and you can see testosterone levels there in females that don't vary as much. There's a little bit of a variation. Cortisol, the major stress hormone, there's also a very large diurnal fluctuation in both males and females. That varies by age, but we can talk about that later. In terms of manifestation, neural manifestations very different between males and females across a variety of diseases. Cognitive disturbances, again, kind of mirror that. So with schizophrenia, you see greater manifestations for cognition, and schizophrenia in males, you see it more in Alzheimer's disease and depression. I'll show you a tiny bit of that work. Here's one of my favorite examples, so some of you will have seen this already. This is males versus females. Looking at temporal lobe volume, and males with schizophrenia had a smaller temporal lobe on both the left and the right side. But females with schizophrenia didn't show that at all. In fact, if anything, they showed an increase on the left-hand side. So you can imagine if you tried to smush that data together and say, oh, you know, we don't care about sex differences, that you might come to a very different conclusion. It also suggests that the manifestation of schizophrenia is very different and might need different treatment if the manifestation is that different. Here's a treatment. This is oxytocin. Oxytocin is a love hormone supposed to promote trust in people. And it does in males at least. So this is looking at brain activity, and you can see that it increases brain activity, intranasal oxytocin, to males, but in those same areas actually decreases brain activity in the female. So you see the exact opposite effects. So just because we know that a drug or a treatment might work in males does not mean that it's going to transfer the same way as it is in females, and that's why we need dedicated work in females. There are a lot of examples of not a lot, there are some examples of sex differences in mechanism, fairly good ones about pain, and this again suggests that treatment needs to be different for at least mechanical allodynia. But also infections, so E. coli infections, there's different processes that are involved in males versus females. And even in terms of social play and antidepressant efficacy, it looks like there might be some different processes going on. So now that I've convinced you that sex differences are important, Let me show you why I don't think ABV and SGBA is going to go far enough. This is why we need something more, and this is why I harp about women's health so much. Here's some data from 2009. It's looking at all this data from 2009, but it was published in 2011 because my daughter's like, it's not 2009, it says 2011. That's just because that's when it was published. So 2009 papers. All of the gray means unspecified sex. The purple means both sexes were involved. Blue, males. Red, female only. And you can see great diversity. The worst, I think, is the gray because you should always specify what sex was used, both for non-human and human studies. Human studies, a little better, but we're going to get to you. Don't be so smug yet. Neuroscience, you can see about 25% unspecified sex in 2009 and about 20% both sexes. Much better, again, in humans. So that's 2009. What happened in 2010 to 2014 after these mandates are starting to come into place? This was just done on 5 different journals in neuroscience, so specifically looking at neuroscience. But the good news is the yellow here is unspecified sex, and those rates are going down. That's good. People are starting to realize, no, I need to say what sex. It's still pretty high. It's like about 20%, gone down by 25%. That's good, but still, it's going in the right direction. Both sexes going in the right direction. It's about a 20% increase. This is why I'm concerned. Male-only studies, if anything, is rising, and it's at 40%. Female-only studies, really low, 6% of the studies. This paper came out, and it's big. In Europe, they don't use the word sex. I don't know why. They are not, even though the World Health Organization, they just like to use the word gender all the time. So the title, I didn't change it because that's the title, Gender Differences in Clinical Registration Trials. So here they were arguing that actually there is a good proportion, and of these drugs, there is a good proportion of females that are compared to males that are used. So I think the green is proportion of females in trials, the blue is a proportion of females with disease, and the yellow is proportion of sex unknown. You can see a bit of disparity that needs to be improved in terms of phase 1, 2, 3 clinical trials, right? It's not great for phase 1, but pretty good for phase 2 and phase 3. Great. So actually, this is supposed to be a good news story, and a lot of federal funding agencies are using it as, this was published in 2018. Look at how far we've come. The problem is, if you dig into the article, only 28% of the studies reported outcomes by sex. It's not enough. 72% are not. So it's great that the 28 are doing it, but what about the other 72? So even though this comes from that Berry and Zucker article, even in the studies that use both sexes, humans and animals, remember I said don't get smug, I'm going to tell you something, 80% of them didn't analyze by sex. 80%. So they might have used both males and females, they just didn't analyze it. How do we know that if there's any difference if you don't analyze by it? This comes from that other article. It's around 15%. Doesn't matter what year. It's still really, really low. So people are using both sexes, they're just not analyzing by sex. So it's not working, I'd argue. This is from NIH's mandate. You have an NIH clinical trial. You have to use males and females in your study. 72% did not include sexes as part of their analysis. 72% of the studies. That's appalling. So 26%, or I think that's what it is, 26.2% did include sex as part of their analysis, but that included people that use sex as a covariate. And I understand that some of you will be thinking, sex as a covariate, I don't quite understand what that means, but it actually doesn't give you any information about whether there's a sex difference or not. It's statistically removing the variation between those two variables and then doing. So it's like taking out sex. So of that 26%, it would be really interesting to know who actually didn't use a covariate. And I'm assuming that the majority of those studies used as a covariate, so controlled for sex rather than studied it. What do you lose when you don't consider sex as a factor? I have a very good example from this from the genetic literature on asthma. They found 47 genetic signatures, are called SNP, single nucleotide polymorphisms, that were associated with asthma in a sex-specific way. 47. If they analyzed the data together, they lost 26% of them. 26 of them, not 26%. They lost 55% of them. So you lose a lot of information when you don't do a sex stratified analysis. And when they did the sex, so it's often the case, you'll often hear, oh, I love to look at sex differences, but I'm not powered, which just means for the lay people in the audience, it means, oh, there's not enough of a sample size. I can't possibly do it. In this study, they looked at that, and they said, actually, we had more power. We had greater effect sizes when we did a sex stratified analysis. So I always say, try it. You're not going to know until you look, right? So sex-based analysis is really important. I'm choosing to show you something from my own work. So this is looking at postmortem tissue, males and females, looking at neurogenesis, birth of new neurons, in people that were either controls, depression, prescribed antidepressants, had depression with psychotic symptoms, prescribed both antidepressants and antipsychotics. We saw a big effect in the females. We didn't see it in the males. That's what it looks like on the left with both of them segregated out. That's what it looks like when you combine them and don't pay any attention to sex. You lose that significant effect. Not just the significance doesn't bother me as much as you lose the idea that it's true in females and it's not true in males. That tells us something about the efficacy of the prescription medicine. I don't have data on this, but I saw the study and it really bugged me, so I thought I'd use it as an example. So we now have to, in NIH, you have to use both sexes, right? Unless you say why you're not using both sexes. This is what people are doing. So this is an Alzheimer's model, mouse model versus wild type. Let's just look. The females are not too bad, right? 7 in one and 10 in the other in the wild type. It's looking at capillaries, looking at vasculature with Alzheimer's disease. Look at the males. In the Alzheimer's model, it's 21 males. In the controls, it was 2. How can you learn anything about whether or not there's a sex difference if you don't have balanced numbers, or at least partially balanced numbers? That's just bad science, and no offense to the people that got it in Nature Neuroscience, #2 journal in neuroscience in the world, but it's yeah. I told you it was a rant. I'm getting near the end. It's getting near, not quite. I love the title of the study. It was the Galea study that I showed you earlier that said, 72% are not, clinical trials are not analyzing by sex. The more things change, the more they stay the same. So that mandate has been in place since 1993, 27 years. And yet still, people are not reporting outcomes by sex. So look at the conclusions, just the first part. We can talk about the second part if we have time. NIH policies have not resulted in significant increases in reporting results by sex, race, or ethnicity. So people are not, it's not moving the dial. You can mandate all you want, but if people aren't reporting the data by sex, we're no further ahead. And we have 27 years of data on this. So when I was thinking about this issue and helping the BC Women's Foundation with their report, I was thinking, how can I drive this point home? I thought, can I look at single-sex studies and show how much progress can be made when you pay attention to one sex versus the other? Of course, this can get a little dangerous, but I looked at cancer. So I looked at prostate cancer. I looked at what the National Cancer Institute has on the website is really what I looked at. But female-only breast cancer and prostate cancer. And you can see survival rates for prostate cancer right now are 98%, 5-year survival. That's amazing. Breast cancer is 90%, still pretty good for female-only breast cancer. Lung cancer, colon cancer, still pretty low, especially lung cancer. It's dismal levels. And there might be many reasons for the much higher rates for prostate and breast cancer, of course, compared to lung cancer. But one of them could be, I don't think we can rule this out, could be that you have, by necessity, you have to study it one sex or the other. You remove that variability due to sex. The other part is that gains. Right? So I think we've gained survival rates for breast cancer by 16% and 35% in prostate cancer over that 35. So huge gains in the survival rate, much less in terms of lung cancer, a little bit more for colon cancer. So I'm arguing that it's vital to study both sexes, but is it vital to only study sex differences? So no, I say not. Integration and specialization. And let me give you some examples of why this matters. Women's health is much more than how they differ from men. Right? Our experiences can change physiology, and many of our experiences are female-specific. Menstrual cycle, menopause, pregnancy, postpartum, oral contraceptives. All of that is female-specific at the moment, right? And all of that plays a role in terms of our health. So, and I'll be talking much more about this next month, but we can see pregnancy is actually thought of as the first cardiac stress test for women. If you have hypertension during pregnancy, that can increase your risk for heart disease later in life. If you present with gestational diabetes, that increases your risk for diabetes later in life. Those are important things to understand and know about because you can intervene earlier, right? It's actually great that we have these predictive tests earlier for females. Also, special case for perinatal period, postpartum disorders are associated, postpartum can be associated with an increased risk to developmental disorders. Postpartum depression, I'm sure you've heard about, but also OCD, obsessive compulsive disorders, 3 times more likely to be diagnosed after giving birth than at any other time in a woman's life. That's why it's important to study why is that, and can we mitigate against this. Women more likely, females more likely to show depression than males, often twice more likely. And where they see that, where you see that biggest risk is in a unique period of one's lifetime, right? Her reproductive years. And it's often the highest risk to develop depression is actually during the postpartum period, where you go from very high levels of ovarian hormones and placental hormones to very low levels. So does that confer a risk? And when you look, people have looked at withdrawing human females from ovarian hormones, and you see in women that have a history of postpartum depression an increased endorsement of depressive symptoms. But you also see a little blip even in the control group here, which is exactly what Wiebe Voigtjager showed 15 years later, that there was an increase, not depression, but an increase in depressive scores when they removed females from ovarian hormones. And we've shown that something very similar occurs in a rodent model as well. So when you remove females from these ovarian hormones, they're at a greater risk to develop depressive symptoms. Oral contraceptives. And this week we have somebody talking about this because some work of this nature is going on at UBC. So oral contraceptives have been fairly recently linked to depression. But age, first of all, the type of oral contraceptives is really important, and age really matters. So it turns out if you're a teenage female and you're taking oral contraceptives, your risk is quite great for antidepressant use and for depressive symptoms. If you're older, 25 years or older, and you're taking a variety of contraceptives, your risk is actually much less than in the normal population. So age really matters. This is why we need dedicated funding and dedicated research for women's health. It doesn't matter if you're comparing against a male as teenagers. It matters what kind of hormone therapy or oral contraceptive are you taking and what age you are. Last point on this, menopause, associated with a decline, unfortunately, in a number of over a number of cognitive domains, and this is the work of Pauline Mackey. So the black, late reproductive phase, the hatch bars, early postmenopause. And you can see decline in a number of these different cognitive domains. So that suggests that, ovarian hormones that we're losing with menopause, let's give them back. That should increase cognition. And this study, huge, powerful, made a big splash, not just in the medical literature, but also, hormone therapy was not prescribed for a lot. The rates of hormone therapy prescriptions actually plummeted. And I'll try not to rant too much. So what they found was that cognitive scores with this particular hormone therapy are really reduced. But the study has been widely criticized for a number of factors. One is the age that they gave this hormone therapy. They gave it many years past menopause, 10 to 15 years after menopause. And the other is the type of hormone therapy they gave. And a lot of this work was done by, some of this work was done by Cindy Barho sitting in the audience. So the type of hormone is a conjugated equine estrogen. It's mostly estrone. Estradiol, you might recall, is a powerful estrogen. It's only 0.5%, so very little of that. And we already know from meta-analyses that the type and when you give this hormone therapy really matters. So 80% of studies will show a benefit of estradiol hormone therapy if it's early in menopause. 20% of that conjugated equine estrogen, it's called Premarin, will show a positive effect early in menopause. But if it's significantly past menopause, 10 to 15 years, you actually see less of a benefit. Estradiol, about 40%, but you see a detrimental effect with Premarin. So again, This is why we need dedicated studies looking at females only. If you did this, there's no point in many ways to compare this to males. It matters, here I'm telling you the age matters and the type of hormone therapy matters for cognition. Females with also have a higher risk for Alzheimer's disease show stronger cognitive disturbances, and that's in this gray here. You can see, I know it's going up and it looks like it means it's better, but no, this means it's getting worse. Cognitive decline is getting worse. You don't see that same precipitous decline in cognitive function in males. And very recently we looked at the same database and we showed that it was females had a higher level of this neuropathology that's associated with Alzheimer's disease. I'm showing you this because I'm suggesting that perhaps females with a higher risk for Alzheimer's disease need a different type of treatment than maybe males do that targets that specific neuropathology. We're too far away from that yet, but it's suggestive. Okay, last little bit. We need specialization because we have these female-specific experiences. It's not just how we're different from males, it's also that our experiences change our health, and we need to study that. Same thing with men's health as well.
Your access code, then press pound. You have one.
Is there a way that we can mute that? There must be a way we can mute that. There we go. I might have muted them so they can't hear me anymore, but let's see. A snapshot of women's health research. So as part of the research that BC Women's asked me to do, I looked at women's health research that's funded by CIHR in BC. And what I found was a little dismal. So only 7 to 8% of research grants are on women's health in BC. They're awarded for a shorter time period, and they're less. The amounts are less than they are for general health grants. Is SABV, SGBA enough? I hope I've already shown you some examples of why I don't think it's enough, because people aren't analyzing by sex, they're not balanced to look for it. But another thing we looked at was how many grants are actually on sex differences. So before 2015, 2% of grants in BC. This is just in BC. We haven't done it worldwide because we read every single abstract. We didn't read the boxes. We read the abstracts to say, are they actually looking at sex differences? Want to guess? Sex is important. SGBA, how many? Guess. 4%? Sure, that's a good guess. 2%, no change. But it's just like that Galea study found, right? It's not changing. So one thing I didn't say is that it's the same as it was in 2004 that it is in 2015. It's just not changing. So what can we do? I think we need to promote the idea of integration and specialization. We need to let government and funding bodies know that women's health research matters, donate, and advocate for specific funding for women's health. I want to give you a good news story, which is HIV. So HIV, 1996, life expectancy was 30 years. 15 years later, life expectancy is now 70 years. Look at how much, that's in billions of dollars. It's U.S., and they are our richer cousins. They have a lot to give. But when you do pour a lot of money into research, you do get good dividends. You do get good feedback. The budget for CIHR in Canada, $1 billion. So just for all health research in Canada, I mean, it's not just CIHR, but all health research in Canada, $1 billion. And there's nothing dedicated specifically for women's health. That I think is a problem, and really a national emergency. Can I call it that? I'm going to call it that, because I told you I was going to rant. So I do think it's important to understand basic neurobiology and disease mechanisms in both males and females, but we need integration and specialization. That's the only way we're going to move the dial. Stay in touch with us. We're on Twitter. We have a web page. We have the seminar series going. And better than our seminar series is the trainee seminar series that Kate Wall and Travis Hodges are doing. And there was one, I think, on Friday, correct? And they have blitzes. So they have 5-minute talks. I think there's 6, looks like there's 6 of them. And you can see a wide range of topics. So thank you very much for allowing me to rant at you for 42 minutes or whatever it was. Maybe a little longer. Do you have any questions? Parker? Thank you for representing the XY individuals and the...
You talked about changing journal policies.
Yeah.
It's kind of a two-part question.
Sure.
So I know you're an editor of the journal.
Yeah.
What's happening on that side?
Yep.
And the second part of the question somebody who submits papers or reviews papers, when you get a hostile reviewer who says, you can't do this just in females,
Right.
why, just collapse, don't disaggregate your data. How do you talk about that point from the journal side and as people who are submitting papers and reviewing papers, how do we deal with it?
I think that's an excellent question, so I'll try to be as succinct as possible. So there are some guidelines, they're called SAGR guidelines, where they're saying they're asking for a lot. So they're asking to put what sex was used in the title, put it in the abstract, analyze by sex. I think that's great, and I think it's appropriate. A lot of journals don't want to adopt it. Some have. My journal has because I get to make the rules. Not so. I'm also an editor for eNeuro, and eNeuro wouldn't adopt it, which is a little bit of a shame. But they do highly recommend that it's in the abstract. They just didn't want to put it in the title, and they didn't want to force people to analyze by sex. But I do think that's how we're going to make it change, right? If you force people to analyze or you don't get published, that will eventually change. However, there is a flip side, which is I'm also saying single-sex studies are also important. And so what do you do? And in fact, when I ranted on Twitter about this, somebody said, yeah, we were denied publication because we were studying inflammation in the placenta, and they said you needed to add males, which is a really difficult thing to do. And I don't know what happened with that. I mean, I'm sure eventually it got published, but often it gets published in, like, Archives of Women's Health because, another journal won't take it. So what I would, personally, what I do if they said, no, just put them together, the sex differences don't matter, I would probably say, okay, here's the analysis together, here it is separately, even though statistically it's not valid to do that, but because you're double dipping, in other words. But I would show them this is the difference, and then readers of the paper themselves can determine whether it's important or not, and at the very least put it in a table even, so that people can see, so people can recreate the analysis by sex if they wanted to. That would be my thing. Yeah, exactly. And yeah, exactly. In fact, that's what we should do really as a cluster, is have some language that people can use, because of course I get asked this question quite a bit, but so that you can just say, here are some papers, and you can just sort of copy and paste those paragraphs. Yeah, I think that would be great, right? Emma, can you write that down? Because I'll forget. I think that's a great question. Marina?
I don't know if you saw the research that came out last week that showed that the rates by married people are more likely to survive cancer, is that they get more aggressive treatment.
So, oh, really?
Yeah, it was really interesting.
Your advocate?
It was actually quite concerning because apparently previous studies found that married people were more likely to have cancer because they had more to live for, yeah. Which is, I know. Anyway, what this study finds is that when a single person goes to see their doctor for cancer, the doctor makes certain assumptions about how much support they have and how much they could actually tolerate having an aggressive treatment based on the fact that they are unmarried. You have to read it.
Yeah.
And then tell me what you think. But I'm curious about this. In the absence of having actual guidelines on how treatment is different for men and women, it seems to be impossible that doctors are making those decisions actually on the fly.
Oh, yeah.
Whether or not, whether as a woman you could tolerate this treatment, and that's having real life consequences in the absence of proper guidelines. Oh, yeah.
And so there are some studies, one's on my computer open. I don't remember much more other than it was about cardiac interventions. And they realized, one is for ER checklists. So they've now made guidelines where they make sure the attending physician goes through the checklist and asks all these questions, because symptoms for heart attacks can manifest very differently in females. So they can be sure that they're not sending somebody home right in the middle of a myocardial infarction, thank you, which happens a lot for females. So that's working. I think that's somewhere in Boston. The other one that seemed to be working was something about, again, it was, the cardiac field is a little further ahead, because I think they've actually really bought into the fact that these symptoms are quite different, but also surgeries can be quite different. You can see very variable effects. And so they now have made checklists for surgeons to go through all of the different things so they don't make these kind of same mistakes. So that's probably what it's going to take. I was going to say something about biases and my favorite quote about armpits and things like that. But it's important to, it's important to realize that we all have biases, so we shouldn't, shame on you for your bias. Like somebody said they're like armpits, right? We all have armpits, and sometimes our armpits stink, just like sometimes our biases are really bad. And so all we should really do is say, thank you for telling me my armpits stink, and I'm going to clean it up. Thank you for telling me I have a bias, and what can I do to clean it up? And part of that is these checklists and guidelines. But, we're far from that. I mean, as I said, I think that the cardiac field is further ahead, but completely agree. I mean, they even, this is, my mom had some kind of collapse in a retirement home, and nobody knew what was happening, and she had full-blown delirium, but it looked like dementia, right? All of a sudden she can remember things. She was, back in her school days and stuff like that, and it was a nurse at the hospital said, oh yeah, we have this a lot, particularly for older women when they have a UTI. So she had all her makeup and everything, and the ER physician said, oh, there's nothing wrong, she just has a UTI, but we're not going to treat it because we never do in the elderly. And I said, yeah, you are going to treat it, because don't you know that for UTIs, and particularly in elderly women, it shows up as delirium. And she got the treatment, and then 48 hours later she was back to her normal self. But there are very few studies on that, and that's what we need. Not just we need the studies, and then we need it to change into policy. And there's this whole thing about second valley of death and things like that.
Not exactly a question, but it's hard to understand what's happening. So NIH has policies. They follow their clinical trials that are based in research studies. CIHR has policies. And then that doesn't trickle down.
Right.
Review committees
right.
don't pay attention to it, and they bring decisions happen anyway, and papers get published anyway. And
that's right. I don't think
it comes up for renewal, and
yeah.
you haven't published about it, but
it doesn't matter.
So you do have a major change in policy now happening in clinical trials.
But I would say no. So it's supposed to be since 1993. We're not any. That Galea paper is 2018. So it's no better after 20 years. Yeah. Yeah. Right. 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 Yeah. So journal policies is one like that. That was the Galea article suggested changing the journal policies, but don't want to adopt it. Yeah, doesn't want to adopt it. No. Yeah. So my point about bringing up the HIV funding at the end, and I was going to talk about the ice bucket, but I could tell I was going a little over. I honestly think it's like that. I know it's trite, but if you build it, they will come. So, and I know because you're a reviewer too, we do often see people just adding females into the study because now you have to, you're mandated to use it. But it's written really badly. So if you know anything about the sex difference literature, they're quite bad grants. And so, but unless you have that understanding and that expertise in why sex differences matter, you're not necessarily going to catch that. So I think you're going to get better grants. So one is like the Sex as a Catalyst grant that CIHR ran. They ran it twice. There's a very good success story there, which I actually put up very briefly, which was the E. coli stuff. It's Paul Koobs, I think is his name. And he was waiting for an opportunity